Good evening, everyone. Professor York here with a short mini lecture on some items that will help you in this next week as you deal with your initial client interaction and preparing for your first debrief presentation, which will be presentation number 3 for this class. So the two items we will talk about is a client engagement rubric and the scope. So we've been on this journey and on a number of different things, but right now what we are looking at is the client and the scope of work, and this is what we're going to focus in a little bit on this journey today. I have the rubric that I've posted on PolyLearn, but I wanted to hit a few things. So first and foremost is you've already sent your client letter, and I've already given you some feedback on that. So there'll be points that will be awarded for how well that letter was done, how professional it was, if there were improvement opportunities, etc. The client engagement, I'll be with you, and the reason why I'll be with you, I want to observe in terms of, how you engage the client. Did you have an agenda? Did you have questions? Did you focus in on the priorities? And did you define what success, the client defined what success would look like? Also I want to see how much the team was involved in the engagement. So that means you got to be doing a little preparation on your part, because you need to be able to engage the client, make sure the client knows how enthusiastic you are, but also get the client enthusiastic about your working on their project over the next 6 weeks. And as usual, as we evaluate PowerPoints, we will have a quality appendix using headlines and storylines. So think about your storyline as I've emphasized beforehand. Your presentation delivery items will be the same as well. These pieces overall will constitute half of your grade, about 51% of the points. But where we get into the content, deal with content issues around your engagement and also your client issues. So this is going to be a little bit easier and more straightforward than presentation 2, which was definitely a challenge and designed to be that way so that you would be better prepared for dealing with future presentations, but also look at things strategically. So naturally we will look at SCQR. Did you present the client situation very, very clearly? Okay. Situation, complication, question, and recommendation should be pretty straightforward. But we're going to get into, I think, some things that are very, very critical, which is the scope of work. Clients want the Maserati. They want the fancy car. They don't want to pay a lot of money. They want you to do it tomorrow. Reality is that you're going to have to frame it. You're going to have to use FOD, which is we'll talk about in a few minutes in terms of framing, objectives, and deliverables, especially with the time frame that you have. Now, as you are doing this, you need to make sure that the objectives the client has been stated and stated clearly. Are they quantitative and not something that's soft? So remember SMART objectives. And if they're not quantitative, how have you been able to help the client redefine these in such a way that a plan can be developed to achieve them? Okay, because this is very critical, because clients sometimes are very, I'll just say they're not very clear in terms of what their objectives are, or they may give you just too broad-based. It's up to you to get specific and help the client really dial it in. Project plan. Now that's another piece that I'm looking for, and I do grade very hard on that. I don't want something superficial. I actually want your work plan that you should be integrating into your charter. I also want to see an updated charter to look at any changes in roles and responsibilities. And then what additional questions do you have for the client? Because that meeting should generate additional questions. And last but not least is, get to the client, okay? Is the client excited about the opportunity? Will the client put time and willingness to help with the project? And how is this expressed? And then does the client understand the role? And last but not least that we should be in there is, have you tied down a specific time, okay, on a regular basis for communication? On a weekly basis, every 10 days, etc., etc. So I think that those are some things that you need to think about. That is worth in total 49%, so almost 50% of your grade there. So I use that to sort of frame out this whole area called scope. Why do we scope things? Because clients always want more than they can pay for. So client really wants this, but realistically you can deliver only the Yugo. Well, we see that in the real world. And that's why we need to have a tight scope. We need to be on target with the client needs, but also deliver successfully. Remember, in terms of our discussion, in terms of the art of client service, those key points about being able to manage client expectations and really have a good, very tight scope of work, both for achieving your success with the client, but if you were working for an agency or work in an organization, you don't want to set yourself up for failure. So remember SMART goals, but remember that most projects have three major constraints. In some cases, you could think of a fourth. But the three major constraints that you have to think about are your scope, your time, and your cost, especially in the agency because we are utilizing resources. But in this case, we are looking at your scope, which is how broad it is versus the amount of time and resources you have. Remember, you're stretched across multiple courses, so realistically, if that client makes broader, then what will happen is the payment will be in terms of time. So think of the gardener example that I gave you in class today, and you'll best understand in terms of why the gardener will always approach you relative to if you go beyond the scope in terms of an additional proposal request for some additional payment and get buy off on that payment that you would have to make. So sometimes, scope doesn't get defined clearly, and, you feel like you're in a snowstorm. And this happens a lot in projects. So it's up to you, and I think in your meetings that you have, is to really get this really, really clear, really, really focused, and really achievable. Okay, especially with the time frame that we do have. So I use a technique called FOD, or frame, objectives, and deliverables. And this is something that I will expect in terms of what you will present. I don't want it on 5 slides. I want it on 1 slide. Okay, it all needs to be clearly defined. Why do we do it? I actually, in the real world, will put that into a proposal, very, very succinct, in less than a half a page. Why? You need to understand where the client is coming from, what the background situation, what are your key objectives, and what are you going to deliver at the end of the day. So let's talk about frame. Framing is very important. I didn't give you a book called The McKinsey Engagement, but it's a classic book that's used in MBA schools in terms of for building teams, as well as focusing in terms of problem breakdown and ultimately research and then presentation. It's used by the McKinsey & Company group, and it is a very, very effective book. But framing is probably one of the pieces, and it's in the focus piece, the first piece, which is most critical to success with client projects. Let's look at this example, which came from basically the Sloan Management Review. The problem that was framed in terms of was there was a problem with an elevator, that it was going too slow. People were waiting too long for the elevator. The natural solution that most people pivot to is, well, let's just make the elevator faster. We, by nature, do these very lazy shortcut decisions because, we just think that that's the most expedited way to be able to address the issue. Okay, so how could we do that? Install a new lift, upgrade the motor, improve the algorithm. But the question that we need to frame appropriately is have we framed the question properly? Is it that we perceive the elevator to be slow, or have we really should be addressing what the real issue, which actually is the same issue we see waiting in bars and restaurants, that the wait is annoying, and this is a classic queuing problem. So if that is the case, then maybe we would reframe the problem rather than the elevator being too slow to, I hate the wait. So with that said, we change the frame and we make sure that we're focusing on what the issue is. So how do I make the wait feel shorter? Put up mirrors, play music, install hand sanitizer. A good example that I'll give you in terms of shifting frame is actually with one of our clients, Kennedy Club Fitness. They think that the problem is related directly to the they'll get a fall off of almost 50% of their club members, and they think it's due to their closing process. But the question ends up being is there something in terms of loyalty, in terms of engendering loyalty, and maybe that they lost those individual members early in the relationship process, and as we know about customer loyalty, it's so critical. So we need to think about how does we enhance customer loyalty so that we can increase in terms of recurrent business or sign-ups at the end of the annual period. So we talked about frame. What about those objectives? Well, remember I talked about SMART, but I like to think of objectives as being action-oriented: to do, explore, and to identify. They're action statements that define what to do, and they are SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So I would like to see that as you do your FOD. And then, last but not least, is those things called deliverables. Those deliverables will be your research data, your report, your marketing plan, your brand profile, your marketing campaign. These are the deliverables that we agree on, okay, are the agreed on work products that you have. This is what ultimately the client will judge you. This is what we will evaluate in terms of final performance. You have many times a final presentation for this class, and in that would integrate your argument around supporting your recommendations, but with your recommendations will be these defined upon deliverables. So here's an example in terms of deliverables and milestones. Remember, milestones are very, very critical in your project plan. So if you're building a house, there are key milestones that you achieve, okay, which is applying permission to build, starting the building process, and moving into the house. They relate to ports and time. Okay, deliverables in contrast deal with outputs that we want. The drawings, the building, the kitchen. This is what the client will want. Those hard things that they can be able to enjoy, review, and be able to put into some sort of action thereafter. Here's a real-world example that I use in terms of very short proposals. I didn't put the frame in there, but realistically, I usually have a frame that's defined in terms of a little background situation. In this case, this happened to be for some market research I was doing for a client. So you can see some specific objectives and then a really, really tight scope of work. That's important to have a tight scope of work, especially if you have been put on tight budgets, because at the end of the day, what you need to make sure is that you're utilizing your time and your resources appropriately, and that your client agrees to those things. So that's real world example 1. Real world example 2 here is the same thing, and this actually was something I did, is I had to do it because the client had negotiated a much less than normal price, and therefore, as I mentioned in lecture, I had to build in a very tight deliverable scheme and scope of work so that as the client had different needs that we could not necessarily be taken advantage of, but that we get the value and we give the value, but we are compensated for the value because we have to use time and resources that are there. The bottom line is FOD really makes a big sense. Okay, frame, objective, deliverables. If you focus on FOD, your project will be a success. That's it for now. Hopefully this will give you some perspective. Use these tips and think about it when you're having your client meetings, because it'll help you be able to focus your questions, gather data so that you can tighten up your scope that you'll need to have signed off, okay, after our debrief presentation next Wednesday. If you have any questions on this presentation, feel free to reach out via email. I'm always there for coaching and counseling.